I don't know if you've read The Giver. If you have not, I suggest you do. It's a young adult book, but and it's often in the curriculum for, I don't know, maybe 8th, 9th graders, middle school, which is when I read it, when my children were reading it, but it's very good. Do you love me? There was an awkward silence for a moment. Then Father gave a little chuckle. Jonas, you of all people, precision of language, please. What do you mean? Jonas asked. Amusement was not what he anticipated. Your father means that you used a very generalized word, so meaningless that it has become almost obsolete, his mother explained carefully. If you have read the book, you know it's a utopian thing where people take pills every day. They don't know they're being drugged, and they don't have any emotion or anything else. And so love is a meaningless word to them. Anyway, it's a good book about language because it's very interesting, the words they use and the choice they use. Obsolete words? Yep, we have them. And if we take that example, we can go on with our own. In politics, conservative, what does that mean? Liberal, what does that mean? They're meaningless anymore because they've been overused, they've been ascribed to many things. Left-leaning, right-leaning, pro-life, pro-assisted suicide. Pretty much anything that's anti or pro has been used to sway people one way or another, and they're not words that really are very meaningful to people. Give back to the community is one of my most hated phrases ever. It means nothing anymore. Just say what they're doing. They're volunteering for the community. They're supporting the community. They're providing services for the community. Because now everybody says it. Really, very. Yes, I'm very serious about this. I really am. Kind of
paying it forward.
We can, yeah, there you go. There's another one. There's another one. But, you know, we could make an endless list. You guys could all add, as you just did to this one, things that really don't mean. And what you really want to do is say what's going on instead of using the jargon and the words. And that goes right into that. They become obsolete and meaningless because they're overused. And that's really what happens. A lot of writers have their own favorite words, and usually they're in transitional phrases. The ones that are used the most are and, but. However, still, in order to, for writing, yet is creeping in there quickly, and they are rarely needed at all. Still is a poor word choice for other things because it has implications. If you say police are still investigating the crime, you're sort of saying, like, why don't they hurry up and get this done? So you don't need it. Just police are investigating the crime. Better to leave it out or say it remains under, but there's lots of other ways to say it. Same with fires, same with all sorts of things. The EPA is still trying to figure out whatever. We're implying that they're taking too long. So you want to watch. That's a dangerous word. And it's used all the time. I probably take that out of multiple times every day out of stories. Solutions. Self-editing's the first step. Know what traps you, know what you fall into, know your own language. This is more for the writers, of course, than the editors. And freshen up your own work. It makes you a better writer, it strengthens your vocabulary, and it makes you more precise. I have some that are, you know, basically I do. I spot still and I just note it out almost automatically. I see in order to, I note it out automatically. I'm never one to say don't ever use a word. So sometimes I go, oh, well, actually in this case it works and it's needed because we are trying to emphasize something. So again, it's about only using them when they're best. But I encourage reporters to start to get really familiar with yourself, and you know this, and if you stop for a moment before you file a story and go, I'm doing that again, I'm using that word again, it'll make you a better writer, and just mix it up a little bit and get out of those traps that you fall into, because it's very easy to do. Find the best word. And in finding that, jargon isn't ever the best choice. I can't think of a case, and if somebody can, chime in. The jargon's unless you're writing about jargon and making fun of politicians or making fun of educators or the military or all those people who love jargon, coaches, yeah. It creeps into virtually every article we write. It's really hard, and the more a beat reporter becomes familiar with their beat, the easier it is because they start to understand the jargon. It starts to become meaningful to them, and so it's an easy thing to slide into. But go back to the old, on a bar stool in a coffee shop, that's how your lead should read. How would you tell your story to somebody you're sitting next to? Would you say, oh, the folks in Denver were working across the aisle today? No, of course you wouldn't. You were saying, God, they were actually getting along. Or something like that. So those are the kinds of things that you want to think about when you're doing that. Don't pick up the words from your sources, the city councilors, the county commissioners, the environmentalists, all those people. It's our job to translate what we hear and what we're told into common English that people understand and that's meaningful for them. And it's an editor's job to catch it when it slides in, because we know it slides into those reporters' stories. And that gets down to who are we writing for? We're not writing for the politicians and the superintendents and the special interest groups. We're writing for the general public. All of those people are, of course, part of that general public, but we're not writing specifically to them. And most of those people don't have the time, even though they'll say, well, we wish we'd get the straight story. They're not going to sit and listen to the meeting that's recorded or online. They want us to do it and figure out what's important for them. We want our stories to be correct and fair, but not in the words of those sources. So it's fine to go back to them and say, hey, I'm sort of interpreting your work, especially if it's a complex or a highly a science story. When I did the military, I was constantly calling sources back and saying, I want to say it this way. Is that really going to be like totally off base? And I'd run through, whatever I was writing about, some new military contract or some new weapons system, and it's sort of like, can I say this without, looking really stupid? Because you don't want to get it wrong, but you also don't want to just put their words out there that nobody else is going to understand. So guard against that jargon trap. It's really easy to do. And again, you begin to not even recognize that it's jargon because you're kind of using it with your sources. You're talking to them to get more out of them. And when you speak their language, that's a way to do that. So it's really easy to fall into that jargon. And since we are writing for real people, hopefully, we want to write about the impact. Why it matters, what it means to the people who do most of the living and dying in this town. That's one of my favorite quotes from movies, is because I think it applies to journalists, not just to bankers, which is the case of where it comes from, where he's talking about he's lending money to most of the people who do the living and dying in town, the little guy. And that's what we do. That's who we're writing for. We are not writing for the mayor, or the head of the commissioners, the president of the board. We're not writing for the dean and the president of FLC. We are writing for all the other people. That's the most important job we have. So writing about process is what we get into a lot of times, and that's pretty boring. We got to say that the council approved a story, of course, or approved a story. I hope they don't approve stories. Approved a new law or a new whatever they're doing. But to get down into the weeds of things is rarely interesting to people. And our stories tend to be very process heavy and don't go out. We rarely have a quote from an expert. Shane's actually coming up with something we might use to get a little pool of experts here soon, where we can call somebody and say, what do you think about this? If you're an expert about utility rates, or you're an expert about something or other, we can get people, more real people in the story that aren't part of the process. I suggest to reporters that every time you sit down to write a story very quickly, and you can put this, I used to do it, head up there, why am I writing this on the top of my computer? Because that keeps you focused on why you're writing it. Not because I'm hanging around going, what stories do you have for me today? That might be a reason, but It helps you focus in on the story and what are the important elements that you need to have in there. And editors should have above theirs, why are we writing this? Why am I reading this? You can do it that way if you want. Who would want to read this? The same thing. And if we can't answer those questions, we've got to stop and say, what do we need to do with this story? If it's an important issue, how do we need to write it? How do we need to edit it to get it across to people what we need to get across to them? And it's easy to say, well, it's important. You know, it's important that they're going to raise the fines on parking. That's probably not a really good example because people did want to read that. But you can, I'm sure, think of another story that maybe, you know, who cares? Why am I reading this? Why am I reading about sewer rates again? Why am I reading about housing costs again? Housing prices going up or down. I'm not in the market for a house. Well, it might say other things to us. So we need to find out what those things are and include them in our stories to the extent we can. It's not always possible. Sometimes we're on deadline. We got to write fast. We got to write what happened, and we don't have time to go out and find somebody. But when we can, we should. Whether that's a person at a meeting, attending a meeting, someone who's weighed in. If we get this source list created, we can work with that. There are lots of ways that we can find that. Go out to the neighborhood, knock on a couple doors. I know it takes time, and I know that we don't always have that, but when we do, we should start to employ those things a lot more often than we do. Simple, clear writing is not dumbing down, and a lot of people, you know, I don't hear that around here much, but like, oh, we're writing for 5th graders or 8th graders or whatever the level is these days, I don't know. Simple, clear writing means you're reaching the widest audience possible, and that's what we want to do. We don't want to turn someone away in the first graph or the second graph. We want them to understand the world they live in. In this case, primarily, we're writing about Durango, the region, state. I'm a fan of stretching our vocabulary and using some words when we want to, but if you send readers running for a dictionary, they probably won't. They'll just stop reading. Same thing there, same thought, and I don't have this in a slide, but same thought on that is if we use a popular TV show lead, which is, A&E is a little bit different because you expect people to know more. But very often you say something in a lead about a character that nobody's ever heard about, or you ask a question that they're going to just say no to, they're not going to read any further because it's like, this doesn't apply to me. I don't know what we're talking about. So we have to be really careful about what kinds of things we bring into stories to use as examples. I often find that when reporters are trying to stretch their vocabulary a little bit, not always, but often, the word isn't quite right. When I'm looking at a lead and I'm going, what are we trying to say here? I look up words on a daily basis that I read in stories. Online, I don't pull out my dictionary nearly as much as I used to, although sometimes it just feels good to have it in your hands. But I go online and I look up words that are in stories, and I'm going, is that the right word? Is that what we mean to say? Is this going to be meaningful to our readers? And so if you see me change a word in a lead, sometimes that's the case. Often, if the reporter's in the room, I go back and talk to them about it. But let's make sure it's the best word possible. The very best writing, whoops, I used that word very, and I didn't write it though. The best writing is about word combinations, organization, and flow. Or saying the right things in the right order with rhythm. That's what the best writing is. And speaking of rhythm, how do you know you've got it in your story? Who reads their stories out loud sometimes? Not out loud, but...
I read them editing out loud.
Nobody? You read them sometimes? Read through that sentence? How many editors read through out loud? To really...
outside, no one's around.
Sometimes, yeah, no, and sometimes you go and like, that sentence, and then you read it out loud. That's how you know. That is the very best way to know if a story works, is to read it, or portions of it, you know, not necessarily the whole thing. It's sort of like, did my transition work? If you're struggling with a sentence, if you're struggling with a transition, read it out loud. That'll tell you what you're doing. I do it all the time. When you see my lips moving, I'm not cursing you out. I'm reading out loud usually. I'm reading through those sentences, and as I'm changing something, I don't want to ruin rhythm. I want to enhance it. But if a sentence feels clunky in my mouth, it's going to feel clunky when readers are reading it. It will automatically. So it's a really, really good way to do that. Before I get to that, what do you guys read? Beyond the Durango Herald, which I know you read word for word, everything in it every day.
Twice.
What else do you read?
Denver Post, magazines, sports websites, books.
Newspapers.
What do you read, Mary?
I'm reading the prequel to Ender's Game, and, which is a fantastic book. And I'm reading Career of Evil, which is Robert Galbraith by J.K. Rowling.
Okay.
Right now.
Patrick, what do you read?
I read pretty much every day something from the Wall Street Journal. I almost always read their op-ed page. And I read the National Review and the Weekly Standard. Most people would read that. And I read the New Yorker.
Good.
A lot of books.
Good.
Usually political economy.
You read the New Yorker?
Because that's how people get to be good writers and editors, is by reading. That's really the best training you can do, is by reading, and not just what you like, but things you don't like, things that are different. Because that's how you sort of figure out how language is evolving, which I'm going to get to in a minute. Reading current things, reading old things, reading books. I know back when I was on the military, I was on that for a long time, so that's why I use that example a long time. A decade's a long time to be on a beat. I had to read so many military publications, Air Force Times, Army Times, STI Monitor, Air Force magazines, you know, things, the Pentagon Daily Clipping Service that I got. So much military stuff that it was sort of like I got really stiff writing, and I suddenly realized that if I don't read some other things, I am not going to continue to be a better writer. So I started making myself read, you know, just whatever. Novels, magazine articles. Atlantic was one I picked just to read some different kinds of writing, which would be like similar to reading the New Yorker, where you're reading it for the writing as much as anything. So I kind of just forced myself to do that, and boy, it was a huge relief, because it was like, oh, I don't have to write like those military people do. But it was really important to keep your writing fresh. So I encourage you to just read different things. There's no right or wrong answer to that, as long as you're reading some other things that just keep you, you know, some good writing is just good to read.
No, if you read the centerpiece feature that the Wall Street Journal does every day, you learn so much about how they put together a story, where they introduce sources. Maybe it's overused now, the lifestyle, they kind of, some scene from somebody's life as the lead, and then, but you learn a lot.
Right.
They're just so well crafted.
Right. And you can do that with other, you know, Washington Post is the same, you know, the Post or NPR. One of the other things, to read is that, the reason to read is look at styles and how they change. You know, we can look at those big centerpiece things, but if you start to look at, I just recently rejoined AAA, and you get their magazine. And the last time I had it, they wrote fairly long travel pieces. And now it's all a whole bunch of short little things. And I'm like, wow, this has changed dramatically. The design's changed. So if you kind of have read something for a while and then you go back to it, you notice those changes. So that's another good thing, just to see how people are presenting what they do and the design of it. So all of those things are good and help you. Okay, a few specifics. Gerunds. Reporters love them, and apparently the copy desk likes them here too, because they're in our copy everywhere. And yes, we can go, well, you can look it up. I used it for that very purpose. It's basically a verb that's made into a noun by adding ing, but that's way oversimplifying it. Okay? And these aren't all gerunds necessarily, because these aren't. But it's a way to identify it, and I call it be-ing sloppy, because that's what you're looking for, the be and the ing in your copy. And it's like it's using I have been doing this, or I have been, instead of I did this, which is much more direct, much more active. So it's an easy way to find those in your copy, which is how I see them. I spot them. And so instead of I will be going to the show, it's just I will go to the show. It's more direct. It uses fewer words. It's more active. So you can look up gerund and have fun with that and see which ones are and aren't. But it's basically, that's what it is. And I'm no grammar Nazi, so actually I learned about gerunds when I started learning about editing and how reporters really like them, and I probably did as a reporter too.
Check out the PRT if you'd like to see gerunds, because they are from one end to the other. I can only change so many with them, but
And you kind of go, but it's something, it really makes your copy, start to look in your own copy form, and it makes it shorter and quicker, and it's a better read without them. Some more. Majority versus, some of these I've talked about in some other things too in our weekly meetings. We usually mean the most. Most of the people at the meeting, not the majority. The majority is 51%. So most is just a better word. If you're talking about most of the people that went to the parade were dressed in costume.
There you go. I hadn't updated.
I'm sorry. I might not have hit it enough. Utilize versus use, I've talked about that too. Choice is obvious. I don't even know how utilize became a word, became widespread. It is a horrible word. Don't use it. False ranges, I've talked about this. 1 to 10, A to Z are true ranges. We know what comes between them. We do not know what comes between soup and nuts, even though that's a very common phrase. It's a false range. So try not to use a range unless if you're saying from Durango to Cortez, of course, we know on the road, on Highway 160, what comes between. But if you're saying from firefighters to nurses, we don't know what comes between that. What comes between it? So just say, including groups such as firefighters and nurses and whatever you're trying to say. It's really common. False ranges are very widespread in even some of the best publications. It drives me nuts because it's not precise writing. Okay, major. We use that. That's another word that's overused. Major storm, major impact, major event, major this, major that. Think about, would you say a minor storm? No, because then it wouldn't be a storm. It would just be a shower, or it would be a snow flurries or something else. You'd use a different term. You might use minor impact, but there's probably a better choice. So watch how your words like that you're using are, whether they're actually necessary or not. And this is basically, just to wrap it up, language does evolve, and we have to keep up with it. That's part of our job. If you use words, if you write, if you edit, if you're a wordsmith of any sort, you have to keep up with how language is evolving and what it means. And it can be regional. I used to use noontime when I first moved to Colorado, I used noontime, and everybody's like, where are you from, the Midwest? Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. So you start to get to, I never picked up the bubbler term when I lived in Wisconsin, very briefly though. But you do, when you live in different places, you'll pick up some of the language and you'll bring it with you. But words do evolve. Think of the word, and I use the example gay there, just it's a very obvious one of how it has evolved and what it means and over time. So I suggest you, and my daughter almost became a linguistic anthropologist, which is why I know a lot about the evolution of language, because every time I bring it up, I get a lecture about it. But it's actually kind of interesting how much it does evolve, way more than some of the grammar Nazis that are out there think, because that's why we do change how we use language and what we do. And I'm talking about the outsiders who send us little notes with red things circled or call us and tell us about what we did wrong. So keep up. if you don't ever check the urban online urban dictionary, check it once in a while. It's pretty interesting, and it's one of those things that we do need to know when words start to have more meanings and other meanings, and it's very important. So we need to know how language is evolving. And words do matter to our readers. They pick up on what we use and what we don't use and what they think we're implying, even when we're not trying to. It's important for us to listen to those comments when we get them back, and important for us to pay attention. And words should matter much more to us, that we're using them properly, precisely, and concisely.